Where were you born and raised?
I was born in St. Paul, Minnesota, 75 years ago. My birthday was just 2 days ago.
Well, happy birthday.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. And that was a period of time when we just came out of, we were in World War II. We had Korea, we had Vietnam, we had tremendous racial tension. It was a time of hope and opportunity, and all those things, I think, play into who you are at 75 years of age and what's happened between the time you were born in St. Paul and the time you ended up in Eau Claire.
Very formative era in our history.
Oh, true.
And it ties into what we're going to talk about a little bit today, because the first question I want to ask you is, it wasn't so long ago in our history, if you look back, if you were a parent in, say, the 50s or the 60s even, and you had a child that was born with disabilities, it wasn't uncommon for the doctor to say to you, "Oh, I'm sorry for your loss. We'll institutionalize this child, and you make another one that's healthy."
That's correct.
This actually happened. You must remember, you must have heard plenty of stories of things like this in those days.
Well, it's true, and I know individuals, and I've had people in my classes over the years who had sons and daughters who it was recommended that they be institutionalized or put in a foster home. And that was not an uncommon type of situation, and placed a lot of stress on families and on the children and things like that.
Just about the time you began your career as a professional, this was all changing, though. And what happened was, something happened here. This was, I was still a child at this time, and so your input and your insight in this must be very fascinating. But at this time, the way of thinking was changing. What happened during these years, and what was developing, what was ongoing that made people think, you know, we got to do something different?
Well, there were a number of things I think that were happening, and it's much more complex than it appears. It's just not the notion that we had some federal legislation and federal push, but what created that, I think, is an important thing to keep in mind. So there were a number of forces at work. First of all, there were places in the country where very progressive things were going on. It's, for example, in Wisconsin, the public schools had permissive legislation to serve kids starting way below kindergarten age from 1947 on. It really didn't become a common thing until late 60s, early 70s, where we began to work with that. But in St. Paul, they had programs for children with mild, moderate, and severe disabilities, in some cases since the 1930s. So there were progressive places. Populations such as the blind and the deaf go way back into the 1800s, where in fact various kinds of services were being provided. Colleges like Gallaudet and things like that evolved. So there's a long history, including not so much in the public realm, but as in agencies such as United Cerebral Palsy or Easter Seals and things like that, where within the community there were efforts being made to provide services for children and families. As we came into the mid-60s, late 60s, families, prominent families in our nation's history began to play a role in these kinds of things. The Kennedys, as an example, had a daughter who was classified in those days, what today would be called cognitively disabled, in those days was called mentally retarded, who was placed in a residential institution in Jefferson County, Wisconsin, and she lived there all her life. And they invested great resources in programs, research related to mental retardation and teacher training and things like that. And that's not the only example of prominent families where these types of things began to occur. And then people became interested in the notion that all children should have an equal opportunity for an education. And so it began to evolve federal legislation. And some of that was top-down type of things, but most of it was bottom-up. It was parents working in groups, working with their state legislators, with their senators and their congressmen, working to promote change at the federal level, which would again come back to the state level and begin to provide education for all handicapped children. And that would have occurred in the middle to late 1960s. So there was a major effort to expand what became known as special education at the time.
Well, let me ask you this now. So the term special education, we use it all the time. But
Yes.
that was developing in the 50s and the 60s. That term just suddenly came. How did that develop? That term come into being?
Well, I'm not sure of the history really of how that came into being.
But we didn't use it back in the 50s or 60s. No one said special education.
In the 60s was beginning to occur. That's exactly right. There were groups of children that were classified. The label mental retardation in our own state didn't change until the late 70s, early 80s, and it was a product of a group of, I'm told that a group of people who were classified as mentally retarded in Ashland, Wisconsin, in Superior, began to advocate for a notion that we should have a different label that was less negative, and so the cognitively disabled label became a part of it. But groups like were classified as mentally retarded, kids with physical handicaps like cerebral palsy as an example, the visually impaired, the hearing impaired, the deaf, etc. Mental retardation and communicative disorders were prominent areas of disabilities. And so great efforts were made to develop programs in those areas. And communication disorders, of course, had been involved in for many, many years because of their interest in facilitating language and speech development in preschool-age children. So we had that gradual evolution in that time. And since then, we've had changes. We've had mental retardation has become cognitive disability. Children with mild disabilities have become less of a focus, and more kids with moderate and severe disabilities have become a focus. The field of learning disabilities evolved. We saw a shift from the population of children classified as mentally retarded dropping, and now with this new label, learning disabled, increasing. The field of autism